Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to be giving you some tips and tricks for how to play top tier ground in the game of War Thunder. Now, given that I already have some videos on beginners tips and also a video on specifically Cold War era vehicle tips, it only seemed fitting to go over some top tier tips that could help you out with some of the highest tier vehicles in the game. Of course, the first one I'm going to start out with is one that you might have heard before on this channel, but as long as people keep doing it, I'm going to keep saying it. Please turn off your IRCM system if you are on a night map. The IRCM system is on several vehicles, however the most prominent premium vehicle that you will see is the M1A1 clickbait. The IRCM is an infrared countermeasure system that is specifically designed to defeat optically guided missiles. However, the infrared spectrum that it shines its basically bright light on is the same spectrum that night vision works on. So on night maps, it is basically a giant searchlight. You don't need a specific button map to turn it off. You just go into the radial menu, fire control system, switch IRC on or off. If you take the M1A1 clickbait into the test drive at night, you can actually see not just your IRCM, but also how bright the IRCM system is on the T90 test target. These systems are insanely bright. In fact, they are so bright that you can basically see them from the air spawn if an opponent is pointing them at you, and guess who gets the missile first if that's what I can see. Now, generally speaking, the number one thing that I do, or at least try to do, I sometimes forget right off the bat and do it after a few maps, is to immediately check where the ammunition is located in the tank. This is especially true for top tier because at lower tiers you use APHE or armor piercing high explosive rounds, so any of those rounds entering your crew compartment is probably going to kill you regardless of how much ammo you take. And even if you go into the mid tiers, the Cold War battle ratings start to get more cramped crews and their damage models aren't as elaborate, so there aren't as many things to catch shrapnel. But by the time you get to top tier, the damage models are more elaborate and everybody is using APFSDS rounds that have basically a cone of damage. So understanding where your ammunition is to try and keep it out of the path of potential enemy shells is actually pretty important. Fortunately for you guys, the game has come a long way since it did when I started playing the game, and you can actually access both your ammunition and your first stage ammunition very quickly. You simply go to the X-ray viewer and then you go to the drop down menu and select ammo, and now it will only show ammo. Above and beyond that though, if you mouse over the ammo, the first stage ammo will not only tell you that it's first stage ammo, but will tell you how many rounds you have in the first stage ammo rack, which is really convenient. The first stage ammo is the ammo where it is most convenient for your loader to grab ammo from, or alternatively if you have an auto loader, it's your magazine, and it's also the first place that the game puts ammo in your tank. Understanding where your first stage ammo is and how much of it you have in your vehicle is actually pretty important to understanding how much ammo you should take in your vehicle. To use a good example, the Leopard 2A4 has an ammunition magazine in the turret bustle of 15 rounds. So you can carry 15 rounds in the bustle and 1 in the chamber, and that will be the only place ammo is located. However, as soon as you go up to 17 rounds, now you get ammunition in the front left-hand side of the hull, and this is a really bad place to have ammunition. Enemies will basically hit this by accident even if they aren't aiming for it, and obviously cause an ammo detonation which will immediately take out your vehicle. Especially because the first stage ammo in the back of the turret is considered to be in a blowout panel, so if the enemy hits that, your vehicle will actually generally survive in most instances. So this is one of those scenarios where having more than 16 rounds can be a very big liability. Of course, even when you look at the Soviet or the Chinese tanks that have the autoloader carousel, they also tend to have ammo in other parts of the vehicle that are not as well protected, so having ammunition that is outside of that carousel can again be a bit of a liability and make your tank more susceptible to ammunition explosions. Of course, the one somewhat weird tank that we do have to talk about is actually the Abrams, because the Abrams, if you look at the M1A1 clickbait, it will tell you that there are exactly 17 rounds of first stage ammo, but at a glance it looks like there are a lot more than 17 rounds in the back of the turret, and that's because there are. The game is only counting the ammunition stowage next to the loader as being the first stage ammo. The other ammo in the storage locker is just counted as normal ammo. However, this is the second place ammo will go. So if you take 17 rounds in the main locker, 17 rounds in the secondary locker, and 1 in the chamber for a total of 35 rounds, you still will not have any ammo anywhere but the turret bustle, so the Abrams can actually take a considerable amount of ammo without seriously risking an ammo explosion. Now, some tanks with this are a little more straightforward than others because the British Challenger 1 and 2 tanks only have 4 rounds in their first stage ammo stowage, and obviously that's not enough to fight a battle with. Also, the Israeli Merkava 3s and the Ram Siegel only have 5 rounds in their first stage ammo, which again, not really enough to fight a battle with, but it is important to understand how the game fills out your ammo magazine and where your first stage ammo is located. Now, moving on to something else that a lot of people that are new to top tier might not necessarily know, and that is there are actually differences between the different types of thermals. There are currently Gen 1, Gen 2, and Gen 3 in the game. On the screen, I'm going to show you a side-by-side of a Gen 1 versus a Gen 3. Gen 1's, the pictures are a lot blurrier, it's harder to make out details, and they tend to get a lot more disrupted by things like smoke and fires, whereas Gen 3's tend to be a lot more crisper, and it's a lot easier to identify what you're shooting at overall. So generally speaking, you do want Gen 3's, although they're not strictly speaking required, and all versions of thermals can be used to pick out targets pretty easily at a distance, which is really what you want to be using them for. That being said, if you do have Gen 1 thermals, you might have to switch off of them a lot more to identify what specific vehicle you're shooting at. Now, I've already gone over in the Cold War tips and tricks, there are actually 2 different types of smoke. You have the quote-unquote hot smoke that is from your smoke grenade launchers, and these will actually block out thermals, and then you also have your quote-unquote cold smoke from ESS that will not block out thermals. This is an important distinction to know, but it's also interesting at top tier because there are weapon systems that can be defeated by cold smoke, and you can defeat them if you have thermals while still being able to see things. Just to use some practical examples, if you see an A-10 early firing B-model Mavericks at you, you can pop cold smoke because B-model Mavericks only have a TV seeker, they do not have an infrared seeker, so cold smoke will still block them, but you can also still see through it if you have thermals. Additionally, it's also important to note there are a few aircraft or targeting systems that don't necessarily have infrared, so even though they can still hit you through cold smoke, they will have a much harder time seeing you. The biggest example and the most common one you'll run into is the Soviet Ka-50 attack helicopter that, while it can hit you with Vikirs through smoke, also doesn't have any kind of infrared targeting system to reliably see you, so you can use smoke to try and obscure their vision while still being able to return fire. Now, while we're on the subject of thermal imaging, it is somewhat notable that a lot more vehicles at top tier start getting thermal imaging in the commander's sights. The commander sights are typically much higher up on the vehicle and can pan around faster than the gunner sights can, and often have a better FOV, so you can use the thermals in the commander sights to scan an area quickly to find a target. Additionally, if you do have a vehicle that has commander's gunner controls, you can actually fire your gun directly from the commander's sights. However, firing the gun from the commander's sights is a bit awkward because you do have an element of parallax because you're not perfectly aligned with the gun like you would be from the gunner sight. Of course, this does bring up another minor tip in that commander sights are probably the easiest to block if you accidentally put a decoration in the wrong place, so you might want to keep an eye on exactly where the commander sight is located on the vehicle. This brings up my next tip in that you probably want to take advantage of the ability to use custom sights to change your sights to something other than the default sight, and this is actually for several different reasons. Now, in order to get to the menu to change your sights, it's actually pretty straightforward. You just go to Menu, Options, and then Ground Vehicle Battle Settings, and you will have a prompt to customize your sights. The first reason why I would highly recommend changing your sights is because most vehicles at top tier use APFSDS or Sabo rounds, and these Sabo rounds are very high velocity, which means the graduations on the sight are going to be very close together, and this can be a bit of a problem when using a laser rangefinder because it will automatically set the range, which means your graduations can easily be obscuring the target at longer distances. The second reason is that when you're using a laser rangefinder, the custom sights actually put the current lays that you are on in very prominent big numbers that are very easy to see, so you always remember what your sight is set to. And one of the last major reasons why I would definitely change my sights is that when using thermal sights or night vision sights, it's a lot easier to use the different colors of crosshairs rather than to use the plain black crosshair. Now, as a minor tip for changing your sights, you can actually change every vehicle of a given rank to the same sight, and then you can just go back and change the ones that you want to be different. So if you have an entire rank of vehicles that all use laser rangefinders and thermal imaging, you can just change all of them to a specific type of default sight, and then you can go back and correct the ones you don't necessarily want to have it. Generally speaking, if a vehicle has a laser rangefinder, I usually go ahead and switch over to the custom sights right away. Since we're on the subject of laser rangefinders, one of my biggest tips is that you probably want to pre-laze areas that you intend to shoot at, and this is actually for several reasons. The first one is that while lasing an enemy is incredibly fast, it is not quite instant, so if you already have your laze down, you can simply snap your gun to the target and shoot at them. The other reason is that by the time you get to top tier, a lot of enemies will have laser warning receivers. Lasing an enemy that does have a laser warning receiver may potentially give them an opportunity to back out of your shot, or at least make your shot more difficult. Additionally, and something that you should probably note, is that I will just randomly laze parts of the map while I'm driving along, and part of the reason is that because, as I just discussed in the previous section, sabos do have a very flat trajectory. Out to 200 to 400 meters, you see very little up or down movement. This means that you can actually laze 200 to 400 meters and your round will still essentially go exactly where you aim the vast majority of the time, and this does give you essentially a longer point blank range, so a longer range in which you can simply snap to the middle of the target and reliably hit them. So having a range of a few hundred meters is not actually a bad thing, especially because it can allow you to much more responsively engage targets at medium ranges. Now, while you can use the sight distance controls to manually set your sights to 0, you can also just laze the ground in front of you to immediately set it to a much shorter distance if you really need to, so it's not really a big deal most of the time. This also brings up an interesting quirk of War Thunder in that while smoke generally does block lasers, so you will have to laze things that are near the smoke and not necessarily the smoke itself, trees for some reason don't block lasers at all, and I'm not entirely sure why. This does mean in that if you see somebody on the other side of a forest, you can usually get a pretty accurate lasing of their range. Of course, one big side note, and this is aptly illustrated in this clip, as soon as you laze something like a helicopter, they will probably respawn pretty quickly because basically all helicopters at this battle rating have laser warning receivers. So this can make it somewhat difficult to successfully laze and hit a helicopter with something like a sabo at any real distance, as if they are paying attention, as soon as you laze them, they will probably start taking evasive maneuvers. Now, we've talked about vehicles with laser warning receivers as enemies, but what do you do if you have one and you get lased? Well, if you get lased from a position where you don't think enemy ground vehicles could possibly be, then it's probably not a bad idea to pop smoke, because you're almost certainly being targeted by an aircraft. Simple smoke grenades that almost every top tier vehicle has can defeat a wide array of air-launched munitions. The common American Hellfire, Mavericks, and even the powerful KH-38 can all potentially be defeated if you know one is incoming and you pop smoke fast enough. On the other hand, if you do get lased and you're pretty confident it was another ground vehicle, you should immediately start wiggling your hull or your turret in such a way that it might throw off their shot. It's not 100% reliable, but it can occasionally save you from a fatal hit. Of course, laser warning receivers are at their best when you have some sort of hill, house, large rock, etc., some kind of large obstruction that you can quickly put between you and your target. If somebody lases you and you can quickly reverse behind a building or behind a hill, obviously that is much more likely to save you from a fatal hit. Now, this also brings me up to another point, and this is aircraft targeting systems. For a lot of players that exclusively play ground vehicles, they often don't seem to fully understand how aircraft targeting systems work, and it is kind of important to understand this if you're going to avoid the aircraft themselves. The auto tracker is probably the biggest piece of equipment that the aircraft have that can be a little difficult to counter unless you know some of the quirks of how it works. When an aircraft uses an auto tracker, predominantly used on helicopters but more often targeting pods on planes or getting them as well, it will lock onto you and all of its weapon systems will be directed at you. These are both laser and optically guided. Now, an interesting aspect of the auto tracker is that because it's looking for contrast or heat signatures, it is actually possible to fool it with certain terrain types. The biggest terrain type is actually forest, because if you can put trees in between you and it hurts the contrast and can throw off the auto tracker. Additionally, other vehicles can also serve as distractions that will throw off the auto tracker. If the auto tracker has another vehicle in addition to its main target, it will actually jump between the two targets, which is a bit of a problem, obviously, if an aircraft is trying to specifically target it. And as a big side note, the vehicle does not have to be friendly and it doesn't have to be alive, so hanging around the wrecks of a destroyed enemy can also be enough to throw off an auto tracker. Even without the auto tracker, the munitions can still be guided manually, so the enemy can still hit you. However, it is going to be more difficult and it's going to be more time intensive than if they could simply lock onto you and forget about you. This also brings up another tip for avoiding or at least delaying detection of your vehicle by both aircraft and ground vehicles, and that is using destroyed vehicles as cover. Aircraft in particular usually have to rely on looking for heat signatures or spots from their teammates in order to spot targets, especially at top tier where the ranges you're dealing with are fairly ridiculous. And what this means is that if you are hiding behind the wreck of a destroyed vehicle, it will actually be somewhat difficult to make you out because your heat signature will blend in with theirs, and additionally their vehicle will be getting off a smoke trail that will make both of you look destroyed. On top of that, because a lot of enemies on the ground in particular are going to be sitting in their thermal imaging a lot of the times, this can also be used as a means to fool the enemy, especially if you're not moving. Of course, the easiest way to quickly scan the area without moving and giving away your position while sitting behind a destroyed Hulk would be to use something like a commander's independent thermal viewer so that you can rapidly scan the area and keep an eye on things and wait for an opponent to simply drive past you. Now, one tip for top tier anti-air, and this is one of the things that they added not too long ago, and it's a really helpful quality of life feature, is that in the spawn screen you can automatically change how your radar is scanning an area. So you can change what mode it's scanning in, and more importantly, the range it is scanning out to. By default, a lot of anti-airs will not scan out to the maximum range that they can possibly see an aircraft at. So you can simply have this set at the highest possible range and you can leave it there, and the game will automatically do that every time you spawn that anti-air. This is a great quality of life feature, and I would highly advise everybody take advantage of it. Now, as another tip while playing a top tier anti-air, it is important to remember that while some anti-aircraft actually require you to be basically staring at the target through the first person sights in order to successfully get a lock, quite a few of them, especially at the higher echelons, can actually lock a target from the third person. And understanding which anti-airs can and cannot do this is actually pretty important, because the anti-airs that can do this can scan an area much more efficiently, as you can simply spam the lock button and see if it finds something, versus the other anti-airs that can't, where you simply have to look at sections of skies and hope to see the right enemy. Now, as another aside, this is where crew skills come in, because you can actually do the air alert, and if your crew spots an aircraft, your crew will actually call out the direction and the altitude of the aircraft even if you don't actually see it. So there can be instances where if you suspect a plane or helicopter is up, it's not a bad idea to simply throw out an air alert to see if your crew is calling it out. This also brings up one of my favorite situational tips for fighting aircraft. If you see an aircraft is launching a salvo of missiles at you and you are one of the handful of anti-aircraft that have smoke grenades, you should definitely pop smoke grenades. It turns out smoke grenades, while they can defeat a lot of air-to-ground munitions, don't actually block your radar or prevent you from shooting, so you can actually engage enemy aircraft successfully through your own smoke, but you can also severely limit their ability to engage you back. Of course, this list of top tier tips and tricks for ground RB is not meant to be all-inclusive, so if you have any more that you would like to share, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. If you got something out of the video, feel free to drop a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.